Hello, everybody. I know that Mark Lodato can't be here today. It'll be interesting. So, but right now I'm the only person on. Hello there, Joshua.
Hello, David.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Excellent. I am. I am better, and the Canadians have stopped burning their forests, presumably because there's fewer trees now.
But the fact that the fires have stopped is good news.
Yeah, I don't know if you've heard much about it. The U.S. I live on the U.S. East Coast, and the U.S. East Coast has been covered for days.
I have heard about it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, public schools have basically canceled all outdoor events and just.
hmm
I decided, I'm not exercising. I'll just sit outside under a awning, and that won't be too bad. And I ended up with a headache by the afternoon. So, well, okay, that. To be honest, I didn't know about it. I went out, enjoyed the day. I've got a headache. I look at the news. Oh, I guess that explains that. I'm going
Yeah.
inside now. So,
There were some apocalyptic photographs of New York doing the rounds.
right, right. I live near Washington D.C., which is quite a bit south, and
Yeah.
even so, I mean, serious impact on air quality. It's very, very difficult to get a mental picture of just how big this fire was.
Mm.
Stupendously lots doesn't really do the job.
Y- Yeah, yeah. No, I was out at DevOps Days in New York City, and like the skies were all like relatively blue, and then midway through, I'm like, what? It's all everything's orange.
Yeah, yeah. The moon at night, the full moon was blood. Well, not technically. The moon was blood red when you could see it at all, and that is not normal.
You got West Coast problems on top of your East Coast problems.
Yeah, just
Well, we're
compounding
still
it.
missing on the earthquakes. We missing out.
Every cloud.
There has been an earthquake on the East Coast, but it was an amusement, not anything serious.
David, did you see how I-95 collapsed in Philly?
Yes, I did, and that one's shocking. I understand, that bad things happen, but normally bridges don't fall down even under pretty stressful situations. So I am certain there's going to be an in-depth investigation of that. So
Yeah.
that's rather shocking. All right. So it turns out that Mark Ladada's off this week. So we're going to have to decide on a chair, I guess, for the cat herder. Does anybody want to
I
jump
mean,
for the
Isn't
task?
there a backup, David?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, I volunteered last week to run the meeting when Mark mentioned he would be out this week. So I can certainly attempt to do that. We've got a fairly light agenda, although David, I see you've added something this morning, so that gives us something to talk about at least. So I should first of all mention that this meeting is being recorded and we will abide by the Linux Foundation Code of Conduct during the meeting, as we always do, or always strive to in the SLSA community. As I just mentioned, we've got a really light agenda today. The first thing we always do is welcome new members and give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. So I'm not sure whether we have any new members today. I recognize everyone's names, but that doesn't mean you've been to this meeting before. So please speak up if you're a new member and would like to introduce yourself to the group.
Hey, I'm Josh Clements. I'm newish. I've been lurking a bit in all sorts of OpenSSF stuff just because I saw the OpenSSF day at the last open source summit, and I made the mistake. I keep using the same joke. Other people keep, and thank you, David. You keep laughing. I love it. I made the mistake of telling my boss that I went to those things, and he's like, "Sweet, you're our new person that does that." And I'm like, "All right, cool." But that's okay. I like it. I dig it. You get so far. Everybody's really welcoming. I love the work y'all are doing, and I'm looking forward to participating and contributing.
Awesome. Welcome, Josh.
I'm also near DC, David. So maybe someday we'll go get a beer.
Love to see you. I don't see very many people in person. I have a whole bunch of Zoom calls, so I'm always welcome if you're in the area. Come meet and such.
All right, sounds good.
And I'm Matt Wood. I've been part of I guess attending the integrity weekly meeting or bi-weekly meeting a bit for a while. First time at this particular meeting, but my primary focus these days is trying to get SLSA principles and stuff implemented internally for a lot of our CI. And so, I want to make sure that the spec is I guess understandable within an enterprise context.
That's awesome. If you anything like that you run into while you're working to adopt SLSA internally is definitely feedback we want to hear and try and address. So welcome to the group. Cool. Unless there's anyone else, then we can move on to the next topic. I put issue triage on here, but I'm going to suggest we tackle David's discussion topic first.
I mean, it's still issue triage because this is in one of the issues.
Mike, you got your hand up. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, so I know, I don't remember if, were you here last week, David?
I could not be here last week. I noticed that some discussions happened, but
Yes.
I had a meeting conflict.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I was just like, because I'm like, yeah, we did go over a little bit of issue 873. And particularly, I think one of the things that we were talking about was just to kind of provide a little bit of context that maybe isn't exactly in the thing here was hold on. One thing that was brought up by Mark and a few other folks was like not getting hung up on definitions and more just sort of really just stating very clearly what we're actually intending to do. So like, as opposed to saying something semantically equivalent, just listing, in the requirement, 2 sentences of what the expectations are, right. And something like that.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair point. The phrase I used, I'm the one who created this issue. What is it, 873? My eyesight's not so great. Yeah, 873. I don't know if this is the right phrase, but I think verifiable build is kind of the notion here. I think so much of SLSA right now, the current track is all about protecting the build, being able to explain what was done in the build. And I think this is a different focus of, hopefully you protected the build while it was being built. How well can you verify that thing was actually the thing that was built? And it's, I think it's a different enough thing that, now that we have this construct of tracks, it starts to make sense, especially since basically two things. One, it's a little different. We now have this concept of tracks. And in fact, it looks like we have multiple levels. We can blame Michael Scavetta for pointing out some of this, where some of the challenges in building reproducible builds are because of things like date timestamps. Well, what are the odds that a date time, if software is exactly the same, except there's some internal date timestamp differences, does that represent a risk? Probably not. So okay, so there basically looks like there's multiple levels way to deal with this. So unfortunately, I have some other things that in the short term I'm gonna have to deal with. But one of the other comments was, "Hey, who's going to be doing the work?" I think that's actually a fair question. Yeah, it's all great to have an idea and nobody doing any work. Well, that's not going to go anywhere. So I'd be happy to help with that once I get some short-term things dealt with. I see percent reproducibility. Yeah, so I don't know if you had a chance to look at the issue. It's a little different than that. The gold standard is bit-for-bit reproducibility, and then there's what can you back off if you assume that the source code wasn't malicious, but the build process might have. And there's ways to basically rebuild and detect certain differences that are highly unlikely to produce malicious code. And I'm done. Michael Lieberman.
Oh, yeah, no, I just raised my hand, so it wasn't that. Yeah, I think on that end, there's like a lot of different properties, whatever we want to call them, there, right? Which is like, yeah, exactly, like bit for bit binary reproducibility. That A and B are the same.
Right.
Now, I think even among reproducible, quote unquote, reproducible builds, right? It depends on how folks sort of view what is a build as well, right? Like when it comes to some of that, there's things where can you detect that actually it was built a second time versus just somebody gave you the same artifact? And not to say but I think the thing there, right? I think is we're looking at stuff like bit for bit binary reproducibility. Probably it's number one, but there's also other things that are like, when you talk about reproducibility, one of the big ones that kind of comes out of that, like Basil, Blaze, Pants, and Nick's world, is can you reproduce all the inputs, right? Could you essentially provide the same, because that's actually kind of a very complicated problem of, are you actually holding on to all the things you used in your build, right? Because you're not using it. And this, let's say, for example, one of the things that happens, right, is, oh, it turns out a library gets updated and they delete the old version of the library. And now all of a sudden you're like, oh, well, I haven't updated to the new version of the library, but I can't reproduce this anymore because this thing doesn't exist.
I get for that latter one, let me quickly respond. I guess my notion is that this isn't just that it's conceptually possible, but that someone has independently tried to do, independent. Let me be a little careful here, but basically someone has actually attempted and succeeded in reproducing it at either bit for bit or except for date timestamps, which implies that at least at the time of the event, the bits were available. Now, there is a fair question about, how do you know for sure the bits won't go away? I mean, that's rough. If somebody takes the internet down, there's a whole lot of things I won't be able to get.
Yeah, and I just wanted to throw one more thing out there, which I think is I think tied to that concept and also tied to the tracks, is I think one of the things we had brought up prior, right, was one of the reasons why we had gotten rid of salsa level 4 originally was because we wanted to focus purely on the things that were completely dependent on the build and only the build. But I think when we start to look at some of the stuff like reproducibility, one of the things that it requires is the ability to have access to the things that a previous build had, so that you can then run those, reproducible elements. And then that kind of ties into no longer the build, perhaps, in certain elements, right? You might say, okay, great, now there needs to be something like a source and dependencies track, where the source and dependencies should be at, like you should be able to go back at a given time and look at your source and dependencies up to some time window. Nicole?
So I like flipping through the issue quickly. And I'm biased because my entire system that I work on at work is all about making exactly reproducible builds, because we back up copies of everything, but not everyone's in that position. So I think the key point that we called out would be, could somebody, assuming the things have not been pulled off the internet, reproduce this? I think should be what we figure out how to say succinctly, because I don't think we want to hold over everyone's head the requirement that they do what we do, which is hold a copy of everything. Like, that would be great if they do, because that's, the way we found to work around it in case people pull stuff. But I don't think we should force everyone into that if they don't want to.
So I've been going down that path a while back of what would happen if you pulled down everything and cached all. And some of that gets into what Michael and David have been talking about, which is that when two different people pull it down, you're definitely going to get things in the header, HTTP header, stuff like that. If you start proxying all the requests through and just comparing two different builds that both go out to the internet and proxy and pull down data, you're going to get differences in their API keys to access things. You're pulling down container images. Yeah, Michael's pointing to the project there, the HTTP lock project, timestamps, all kinds of stuff that show up in those HTTP headers that you're getting down to this problem that David's looking at, which is how do you compare semi-reproducible in there? What data can you exclude from that list and still say these two things are identical?
I guess I would say I would exclude the HTTP header straight up, because generally I don't care. If you go down that road, there's the which IP address did I download this from? I probably don't care. Did I get, is this a reputable source? Am I getting the same thing?
In some cases, yes. In other cases, if you want to say, tell me about this container image up on a Docker registry, you really care about those headers because they include the digest of what that tag points to. They include the media type of what that is. And so there are some important values in there. You don't want to just blanket exclude everything.
So one thing I think that's probably worth calling out here, I think a little bit is I think this sort of thing of like, even sort of what are the levels of reproducibility of the inputs for a second. I think that sort of thing is valuable to sort of even make levels out of, right? You might say, great, this level is, you can pull down the same hash every time. There might be, because I think sort of going back and saying, something like source and dependencies level 4 is you have captured those things. Because in certain cases, I think even SSDF or one of the NIST or CISA sort of things that came out recently, or not recently, but one of those things from SSDF or similar does call out, like, if you can, you should actually be, holding on to everything you download, right? So that you always can go back to it for forensics and other purposes. And yeah, like not everybody's going to be doing that. And in fact, some folks might say, hey, I've contracted, I've hired ActiveState or whatever to do those things for me. And other places are going to say, nope, I'm pulling everything down myself. And other folks are going to say, yeah, I'm actually not super worried about that. And so I'm okay with being a lower salsa dependency level than other folks. Sorry, Mikey?
Yeah, so one comment I have to say on the reproducible builds is that not only the parts of the product are important, but also like the build packages and the linter and all the actual code on the pipeline that is going to manipulate this data into an artifact. We've gone, I don't think like exactly this road, but what we've gone in our own product is like following file system on the Cisco level with Pthread, and then like jumping between all these processes that build and containers and namespace to follow all the input and outputs of a build system, and basically exclude out all the files that were not touched and the files that were touched during the build, and basically have like a big amount of data on your build of what was the process on the file system level of building this artifact. So it's not exactly, but it's one view of how to look at the build in a lower level.
Yeah. By the way, I would like to try to separate the can I get the source and keep that versus the build, because I think those are two different challenges. I do agree that it's important to be able to it's important to not lose the sources. Hopefully we can all agree that that's bad. I will note that at least for losing final built code, NPM has a process basically after leftpad where after a certain number of days, they will not delete packages unless, I presumably they would if it was legally obligated. But other than that, they won't delete them. And that at least partially deals with the problem of, hey, I can't get it. Now, I realize there's more to it. But I would like to separate the problems, because otherwise, if you try to put it all together in one place, it gets hard. I think that's why we ended up with tracks in the first place.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we've had some discussion about a separate dependencies track for a while, and a lot of the things we were just talking about would fall within concepts we've discussed, making up that. Can you fully enumerate what goes into your build ahead of time, and then can you later retrieve those things and stuff? One of the things I'm wondering about with the semantically reproducible builds, or I forget what second term you introduced.
Yeah, equivalent was the term that they switched to.
Okay. I haven't read the issue in detail, so forgive me if you've already discussed it there, but I'm curious, like what the how it fits into the threat model of SLSA and how it fits into the guiding principles, because like we ended up with these principles about trusting platforms and like high automation and things. And my experience of reproducible builds is that the value is in being able to reproduce it. So if we start, I'm just not sure effectively, like as someone who has done build systems and has long been an advocate of reproducible builds, I'm just not sure how it fits into the threat model and how it aligns with the principles.
That, I think, is exactly the right question. If you don't mind, I want to try to answer it quickly. I don't think it's as written clearly as it should be. And in fact, on my personal website, I actually talk a little bit about this because it doesn't seem to be written down anywhere, which is kind of a problem. Okay, so all right, so you and I are on the same wavelength here. All right, so and hopefully, maybe as part of this process, we can fix that. All right, so given that, here's the quick summary. The threat model that is being concerned about with reproducible builds is that the source code's okay. It is not, if I just read the source code, it does not describe malicious software. It is software that is intended to do some positive purpose, okay? However, during the build process itself, the software was manipulated in a way so that the resulting build was malicious. Okay, that's part one. And part two is that this implies that somehow someone got into the build process and subverted it. This is not an idle case. This is exactly what happened with SolarWinds, okay? With SolarWinds Orion specifically, okay? Where somebody got into the build process, subverted it. The original source code was fine. The resulting executables were malicious. Now, there's two basic approaches to dealing with this, and I would argue that both of them have their place. One approach is protect the stinking build environment, which seems like a good idea. That's where SLSA is today. It's, basically you try to put the build environment in a place that you trust, harden it up. Now, to be fair, the SolarWinds folks actually did have their own separate build environment. They had some protective measures. I think the review of other people it was not as hardened as it should have been. But it wasn't just sitting underneath somebody's desk. There was a dedicated system specifically for building, and there was an attempt at hardening, though inadequate. So the other approach is, hey, hardening build, very good idea. However, hardening something against all attacks for all future times rather hard. So the other mechanism is protect, but then detect. So if your protection mechanisms fail, do we have a detection mechanism to detect that a subverted build got out anyway? And that's what reproducible builds and semantic equivalency are all about. Can you examine a resultant build and verify that it was generated from that computed source code? Now, all things have limitations. If the source code's malicious, what reproducible builds and semantic equivalency will tell you is that the build system is exactly as malicious as the source code was. All right? It doesn't protect against malicious source code. By itself, it does not protect against trusting trust attacks. So if you use a compiler that's subverted, so if it's not the build process but the actual tools, that's a different kind of attack. If you want to know how to counter that attack, I know somebody wrote a PhD dissertation on diverse double compiling, and there's some other techniques too for dealing with that case. To be fair, those are pretty advanced attacks. And you would need reproducible builds, or at least semantic equivalency, before you even worried about that other case. So I don't think, so basically there is a threat model, there are things it covers and things it doesn't. It's not well documented. We would need to fix that. But
Yeah.
hopefully verbally, and I didn't try to take notes because it's hard for me to talk about these and talk at the same time, but hopefully at least that makes sense that there is a threat model, and whether or not that's important, well, that's why we have different tracks. If you don't care,
Sure.
don't worry about it.
So I know both Mike and Brandon have got their hands up, but I just wanted to quickly respond. So I did take notes. I tried to summarize what you said, David. The thing I wanted to just quickly point out is that we have in the past, in this meeting, discussed how reproducible builds might be a way to achieve SLSA without necessarily having like the level of infrastructure that SLSA currently implies, because SLSA is about building a trusted platform to build these things on. Whereas if you can verify the builds, then you don't have to trust the platform as much because you can independently verify in multiple places. Potentially, right? That's kind of a straw person idea. Yeah. So what I'd like to understand is if this is actually a separate track, and I don't expect you to be able to answer this now, but I am still wondering if this is a separate track or if this is a separate way to achieve the same outcomes we already have, or if there's overlap.
If I may quickly answer, and then let's go on to the people who actually raise their hands, but I think you were asking a question to me. I think they work together, like the old peanut butter and jelly kind of thing. If you can verify a whole bunch of low quality builds, all your reproductions could be subverted too. You want to protect and detect. I don't think you just want one or the other. And maybe you weaken one because you have limited resources, but I think really you want both. You want to harden the build to reduce the likelihood of attack, and then you verify it anyway, so that the few that leak through still get detected. I think, was it Michael or Brandon? I'm sorry, I don't know who was next.
Michael's next, I think.
So yeah, no, I agree with David there. I think, yeah, I think the things from that I think we were thinking through from like the threat model perspective, right, is the majority of stuff in build provenance, right, is around essentially protecting against attacks to the actual build system. And so you can help prevent or detect attacks based on assuming you are running reproducible builds in separate build environments. And I think that was one key bit of it. I think that makes sense to be part of the build, but I think this opened up another sort of open question, especially as we kind of move on to tracks, right? Which is, this is where it's almost like the reproducible element relies on, like as a dependency, it relies on some of these other tracks potentially, right? Because you need to be able to have that. And so I think it's probably worthwhile as we think through the threat models and we think through some of this stuff, it's like if we go to like a source track and a build track, and we start to think about the higher level build track, we start to think about stuff like, hey, these requirements from the higher level build track depend on you being SLSA level 2 source or something like that, right? Because based on this, this, and this, you need to have, you know, you must be keeping the source indefinitely or whatever, right? Those sorts of things then allow you to then say, yep, this build is reproducible because I'm holding on to that information. And it's not something that you would imagine being a requirement of the build itself, because the build should just, if you gave me the same source and the same dependencies, I should be able to reproduce this. But if I'm not, if the source and dependencies aren't hitting those, like, let's say housed indefinitely or whatever, then I can't reproduce it anymore. So it's like that piece has a requirement on these other pieces.
Yeah, we're going up and down the pipeline here because you go up the pipeline to make sure that everything coming in is right. And I was raising my hand because I was going to go the other direction, which is downstream of us in the pipeline. I want to make sure that we don't stop short and say we just want to use reproducible builds for detection. I think it's very trivial to go from detection to prevention of running stuff that isn't reproducible. You can just have multiple signers on your container images if you're building container images from 2 different places, and then set a policy up in your production environment that says, make sure this was signed by 2 different parties out there that I trust. And so I think it's very easy to go from that detection to prevention. So I'd look to add that in there as well.
Cool. Sorry. Yeah. I know how my comment is related to what Brandon just said, but when Mike was talking, one of the things I was a little worried about is that a talk of interdependent tracks sounds like, well, it sounds complicated, effectively. And I'm curious. It's too early to tell, but I will be wary of defining a new track that has implicit dependencies on parts of other tracks, because the track system had been imagined to be independent.
Yeah, so I think they should be very clearly explicit. Like I think the thing, right, with some of the build stuff, as we start to think of it a little bit more holistically, I think you still get a lot of value out of them still being completely independent. But still, at the end of the day, right, like one of the things we were talking about is when you start to tie the pieces together, you get a lot more benefit, right? Because you end up with a situation of like, yeah, if I know, like right now, the build stuff is just like, I'm going to pull in some source code, and the build system should pull in the source code from the right place, but has no idea of whether or not it's actually downloading source from an, that it was hacked, right? It's like, hey, I downloaded this from an approved place, but it turns out it had been hacked or whatever. Whereas you could imagine a source track helps provide guarantees around what that source is, which then makes the build a little bit better. But I do think that for what it's worth, I think one of the things we should probably do is try and keep those dependencies at the higher levels, so that like most folks, it's like, oh, it's very easy to independently get here, here, and here. But if you want to get to the max level, okay, that's where you're thinking about the big picture. And once again, I think that's kind of like much further down the line. But I do think one of the reasons why we started talking about hermeticity and we started talking about reproducibility and why it was like causing us issues was, well, if we require reproducibility, then we need to require holding on to the source and dependencies so that we can reproduce them. And is that a requirement of the build? Probably not, right? It's a requirement of other things that you rely on as part of that sort of overall software delivery lifecycle.
Yeah, okay. So I think we're on the similar page, at least. The way I've always imagined that is that if you fully declare your inputs, you can reproduce the build. If you can't get your hand on those inputs, that doesn't mean the build's not reproducible anymore. That just means
you can't actually reproduce it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just you can't actually verify it, which I think is maybe anyway, never mind.
Yeah, I mean, we're going down and down here, so I mean, there's potentially some really interesting work to come out of this. I think I just encourage us to be focused on like being able to state what the threat is and how we're addressing it before we get too deep into the complexity. And yeah, well, this is super cool, yeah. And lots of cool projects mentioned. So now I'm going to have to read a load of cool stuff later. Thanks for that. Okay. I feel like we've kind of hit the point of diminishing return on that discussion. We can jump into some other issue triage, though I note that Chris drove that last week and he's not here today.
Actually, but before we move on, I just like to get a sense of the room. It sounds like people are intrigued, and at least that this would be a plausible topic to pursue. Obviously, things need to be worked through to turn this from a nascent, vague idea. But I heard lots of interesting discussion. I didn't hear any strong opposition. Did I read the room wrongly? Or is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable interpretation. There's clearly some reproducible build fans on the call. The only concern raised was like how it fits into the SLSA model.
Right. Which is fair. I think that's totally fair. And I think the answer is a different track with important details to be determined.
Yeah, I think if there's the thing that I think is probably worthwhile as takeaways, and once again, I know we all have way too many things to do to figure out all this right the second, but I think the takeaways I heard were, we need to think of what are all the things that would actually be part of this, and then think, how does it currently fit into the SLSA model? Does it require changes to how we think about the SLSA model at all? And if so, how? With that how maybe being something like, actually reproducibility it's a requirement of the build, but in order for you to actually still be able to do the reproducibility, you still need to, it requires some element of source or dependencies, requirements.
Mm-hmm. Did I lose that audio? Okay. Okay. So.
Okay.
All right. So it sounds like that this is of interest from future, and what I would suggest right now is there is an issue. Post your ideas there, and if you're interested in working on this further, mention that too in the issue. How's that sound for a step forward?
Sounds good. Okay. We have only 2 issues open since the last time we met, and one of them already had, they both already have associated PRs, so I'm not sure how useful it is to do triage here, but unless anyone is super enthusiastic to do that, I think I'm going to propose we wrap up early, or unless anyone has any late breaking topics. So if you're in favor of issue triage, give a thumbs up. All right. Okay, then let's go ahead and have a quick look.
Are we doing the issue triage or not?
I think so.
Okay.
We have a council
You
proposal.
left me uncertain. You left me unsure how did.
Sorry, I'm not as proficient at this as others.
No
but
worries.
yeah, it sounds like there's at least a few folks on the call who are interested in looking at the issues. So
I also wanted to ask, did I miss anything, or where did we leave the issue we talked about with the what is it, the resource descriptor type for the format? We said, yeah, okay, we'll hold our nose and call it a minor version revision. I haven't seen any PR.
that is absolutely correct. There has not been a PR. The discussion was summarized in the issue.
Yeah.
And
Do
there
we need
was
somebody to be assigned to this, or what?
that would probably help. There's some ambiguity because we all agreed it would be easier if the in toto attestation folks changed to match SLSA, and a related issue was filed upstream for that community, but that is also last time I checked hadn't had a it looks like there's fairly strong consensus towards doing that. Okay, I will volunteer to work on both of those things.
And don't get me wrong, I wasn't trying to give you more work, but it's just that we said, well, if we fix this in the way we discussed, we should do it quick. You know, I just saw the guys working on the SLSA generator GitHub action. They are ready to announce another implementation. I'm like, okay, as time goes by, we'll have more and more implementations into the wild, and it's bad enough we're breaking them. The
Sure.
sooner we do it, the better. That's why I'm concerned.
So you are, it would make sense then maybe if we reached out to those folks and said, hey, we're going to do this imminently, perhaps you want to hold off.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Would you like to reach out to them?
Yeah, that part I can take.
Okay, cool. I will endeavor to work on the changes required this week.
Sounds good, thanks.
Okie dokie, thanks for raising that. So we had just 2 issues filed since the last time we met and discussed issues. One was on making more of the fields in the verification summary attestation optional and better describing how to verify VSA. And there is an associated pull request for that that Chris has opened as a draft while we work on other things for the v1.1.
So I saw the PR. In fact, I had not seen the issue, but yeah. And I wanted to ask, aren't we breaking backward? This is not a backward compatible change again, right? Because for the producer, yes, because you go from required to optional. But on the verifier side, all of a sudden you need to handle the fact that it may not be there. Am I wrong here?
I suspect not. Yeah, we're making various required fields optional, so that does change the semantics for the verifier. So
But
that's a
we're not invalidating anything, so it seems to me that this is easily a minor change. If somebody did something, they're not getting invalidated.
well, I mean,
before.
It's effectively an API break, right? If something that was required is now optional, and you assume that it's always there because it was required, and now it may not be there, so your API has changed.
I concede your point. I wouldn't interpret it that way, but I mean, it's really whatever this group decides the interpretation is.
I think that's one of the difficulties of applying semantic versioning to something that's not actual code.
I agree. I mean, that's why I was asking. I mean, when I read it, it occurred to me, I'm like, oh man, if I have a verifier that expects this, I'm going to break. I need to change my code.
Yeah, I guess if the view is, I am trying to implement SLSA in my system, did they suddenly add a new requirement on me? I would say no. Therefore, it's not a major rev. I guess if you're receiving SLSA and you were expecting that, and it is now, is that a likely viewpoint?
All right. I mean, wait, we have like, do we have the people from Oracle built Macaron? Does that impact Macaron, for instance?
I don't think we have them here.
So
Yeah.
the SLSA verifier does need to be updated. That's all. I mean, and again, I mean, David, this not to say that we cannot do it, because we already agreed we would break SLSA 1 with 1.1 anyway. So at this point, might like, yeah, pack as many breaking changes as you can on that one. So you don't have to do that every single time.
So yeah, this would, from my understanding, this would break macaron as well as the verifier, as in like, because now if somebody shows it as optional, it'll still try and parse it as required. The macaron folks are working out of, they work out of, I believe, APAC time zone, so they're not going to be on now.
Do they even support VSAs in either macaron or the verifier?
So I'm not sure about the verifier. I have seen it on the roadmap of macaron. Yeah. I do think though that, and this is less about, one of the things here that I think would help, actually, never mind.
Anyway, just please carry on. I didn't mean to derail us. That's just.
I mean, I don't think it's necessarily derailing. It's a valid question. I do wonder if we need to be like, we have a different group. We have different group of consensus here this week than we had last week, right? So that if you ask the same question, you will get a different answer because there's different participants. So of course, I'm wondering, do we need to better document our like approved interpretation of what the SEMVer requirements mean for SLSA? Because otherwise we can just re-litigate this every time we want to change. And then that we either have no constraints or we are always doing major version increments. So I think it's probably reasonable to try and capture consensus around an interpretation of what constitutes a breaking change and not, and then we can kind of refer to that document in future.
Yeah, I think, if I may, I think there's two different issues. Should these changes be accepted? And then if they are, what's the version numbering? I guess we're afraid if it becomes a major number, then we would be even more picky about accepting. with all due respect to Oracle, none of these things seem like terrible hardships. I mean, if you have a policy, it seems to me you do want to identify which one was verified. And leaking the identifier, you could always leak like a short name. Having a URL doesn't seem like a crisis. The URL, here's the URL, and you have to be authorized to see it. I guess I'm not sure we want. Step one, do we actually want to do this? And then step two, what is the version number if we do?
Well, so I think. Sorry, go on.
No, I think David has a good point. I mean, we should look at the actual issue and see whether it breaks or not. That's what I meant by derailing.
Well, I think the context is that we have decided to make a 1.1 release, and these changes are specifically being suggested as included in that. So I think that we've already decided we want to make a release, and we don't want it to be a major version increment. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I'm actually of the opinion, like obviously that the more sorts of these changes, the harder it is to get folks to build tooling that will support all the things. Because like I mean we're seeing this pretty heavily even now in the SBOM space, that like a lot of folks are not actually generating valid SPDX or Cyclone DX. They're generating stuff that looks very similar to it. So obviously the more changes we make in this space, the harder it's going to be to sort of verify those things. So I do want to say that, like, with that said, I do think the more we can encode these changes also into something like a semantically rich data type, whether it's in JSON schema or protobufs with annotations or similar, it makes it much easier on the tool developers to actually do some of this. Because like, for example, myself, right, I've been looking at, like if you just look at the protobufs, a lot of this sort of stuff gets lost in the mix. And you have to kind of read through the spec each time. So in certain cases, there could be a change to something like the protobuf that still has huge semantic changes, and you would have no idea unless you like looked at the update to the actual spec. And so if there's things that my only suggestion is just around, the more we can communicate about these changes and make them also very simple to implement, the better. Because we don't want to end up in a, because already, right, like one of the things is still where we don't have nobody's really following SLSA 1.0 spec yet, as far as I can tell. I know there's a few open PRs and that sort of thing, but there's very few that are actually following 1.0 yet. And similar with like VSA and stuff like that.
Yeah, so in the discussion around annotations, last week we said we need to clearly mark one format as the canonical format in the event of a conflict. And I think I'm hearing you suggest that should be not prose, but like something that code can be generated from.
Yes, as much as possible, right? You're always probably going to lose some semantic information, right? In certain cases, annotations won't get everything, right? Because you might annotate something, as like, hey, this is, even though it's a string, it's bytes, which means it's like a base 64 encoded set of bytes, right? But in certain cases, you might say, hey, this is a SHA-256, and certain things are going to have annotations that say, yeah, we support arbitrary sort of stuff like that. But other things are going to say, no, SHA-256 is just a string, or it's a string with this regular expression, or it's a string of this length, right? And that's about as far as it can go. So you're always going to have, I think, some, there's going to be some back and forth on that. But the easier you make it on the end user, the easier it's going to be to sort of, implement. And like, just as an example, right? Like some of the stuff I've been poking around with a tool called Spectre is like, I can sort of generate JSON schemas and vice versa, take JSON schemas and turn it into Rust code and yada yada. And so the more that we can, or protobufs or whatever, so the more we can kind of include in there, the easier it is for those updates to be just like I pull in the new JSON schema, I pull in the new what's it called, RDF or whatever, one of those things. I pull in the new one and I change, as opposed to changing thousands of lines, I just change a few hundred lines to make it more compliant with the other one. I think that sort of thing is really useful.
Yeah.
And this is, to be clear here, this is from somebody who is actively trying to write salsa tools. And
Yeah,
so
I
if
get it.
things change, it makes it, it makes it a little bit more. And for what it's worth, though, I would still make the change that fixes things. I think the thing that you're going to see, though, is I think there's going to be a question of like, hey, do I wait for Salsa 1.5 or 1.6 or 2.0 before really going deep in it? And when I think about that decision, it's all based on how hard is it going to be for me to implement. If it's just I point to this new JSON schema, this new protobuf, this new whatever, and I change these 5-6 lines, these 5-6 lines, great. If it's, or if I just include, the new Go system, what the Intoto library, the secure systems lib stuff. If I just include the new version, the new secure systems lib stuff, great, it's super simple. If I have to rewrite 1,000 lines of code, I'm a little less inclined, and maybe we'll think about only doing it for major versions.
Yeah, I do think there's a real tension here. I do work on another open source spec project that basically is stuck in a can we ever break major version loop. But I do think there's a risk that if there's too much reliance on like a protobuf or similar, then folks pay even less attention to the actual spec than they already do. And therefore, if you change things outside of the data format, then they might claim compliance without actually having implemented those changes, right? I mean, I think there's a tension. I do completely sympathize with your lived experience trying to implement tooling for this. I'm just personally conflicted about which is the right recommendation to make.
I think from a practical standpoint, to kind of mirror a little bit of what like Arno and others had said, is like, given that nobody's really implemented a lot of these things yet, I think from a like just pragmatic, I'm okay with saying, let's actually change some of these things, as long as I feel like also we're improving on the general process while we're doing it, right? So that we can go back and say, okay, by the time, like even if it's just a line in the sand, we say, hey, look, by the time Salsa's 2.0, we should have most of these things sorted out, that we're not going to be constantly having these things. I think that's okay, right? Because one of the things I think is super nice about Salsa is our ability to be flexible, right? And with that comes obviously its own can of worms, because folks like at very large enterprises are going to say, hey, look, my life cycle to implement something like Salsa is going to be a year. And if you have 5 or 6 versions over that year, that's way different than, hey, you release a new version every year. And so we know we can always be on top of, like, at least it will be one version behind, but we know that we're one major version, I should say.
Yeah. Cool. Good stuff. I tried to capture some of that in the notes, but I don't know if I did a good job. So if you could review and provide feedback, that'd be useful, or just review and update even. Okay, cool. Did we discuss both of the new issues? I think we did. Oh yeah, the other issue was, oh look. Oh, I'm looking in the wrong repository. I was momentarily startled by an issue I didn't recognize. It's because I'm looking at a different repo. So the only other new issue was updating the notes to reflect the fact that OpenSSF ops have moved some of the meeting minutes to new documents that are in their shared Google Drive. So we have some convenience redirectors in the website, and I've already filed a pull request to update those.
I approved it.
Oh, cool. Thank you. And I think that's everything with a minute to spare. So thanks, everyone. It was a way livelier discussion than I was expecting, and a lot of interesting conversation. And I think we've got some good future work. So yeah, appreciate everyone's time today. And I'll see you on Slack, the issue tracker, and then hopefully here next week. Or maybe not next week, right? It's a US holiday next week. I think we agreed to cancel next week for Juneteenth. Is that right?
Yeah, I think we sort of agreed to have the discussion here about whether or not we should cancel.
All right.
I'm down for canceling.
I would propose canceling
the resource descriptor, but we can do it on Slack.
Okay. Yeah.
I would like to make that decision sooner because I want to send that note out and remove it from the calendar before people make any plans. Can we make that call now, or do we need to do it on Slack?
I think I think we can cancel it. If anyone objects, raise a hand. All right. See you all in 2 weeks. I'll see you on Slack and the issue tracker sooner. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, I'm going to send the message off to operations. Thanks, everybody.